Welcome to Future Squared, the podcast all about corporate innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-empowerment. Future Squared brings you a double dose of innovation inspiration every week to help you and your company stay relevant in an era of rapid change and 10x your results in both your professional and personal life. Each week, I'll bring you corporate innovators, entrepreneurs, authors, keynote speakers, and thought leaders such as Steve Blank, David Allen, Brad Feld, Tim Harford, Karen Dillon, Jenny Blake, Neil Patel, Rand Fishkin, Pascal Finette, Ryan Blair, and Ash Moria, to name just a few. While every Friday, I'll bring you Fast Fix Friday, some quick, digestible insights to help you end your week on a high as you head off for the weekend. Future Squared is brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation hub school and consultancy based in Melbourne, Australia and Singapore that works with companies to help them adopt the mindset, methods and tools to navigate change and survive and thrive in an era of rapid disruption. If your organization needs help coming up with ideas, testing and turning ideas into reality, incubating teams, driving cultural change, or connecting and partnering with startups, then visit www.collectivecamp.us. And without further ado, here's today's podcast. This episode of Future Squared is brought to you by Spigot, the largest provider of innovation management software to some of the world's foremost companies, including the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, Westpac, CSIRO, Westfield, AT&T, Citi, Coca-Cola, MetLife Insurance, Pfizer, Sprint, Unilever, and many more. Spigot has powered innovation and process improvement for large enterprises, enabling them to engage with their employees, customers, and partners to build a culture of innovation. Spigot is recognized by both Gartner and Forrester as the leader in the innovation management sector. For a limited time, listeners of Future Squared can get 10% of Spigot's innovation management platform. Taking advantage of this offer is super easy. Simply sign up for a demo at futuresquared.xyz/Spigot. That's SPIGIT. And now for today's episode. Welcome back to Future Squared. I'm super pumped to introduce Jamie Wheal, Executive Director of Flow Genome Project, which he heads up alongside Steven Kotler, who you might know from books such as The Rise of Superman and Abundance, co-written with Peter Diamandis. Jamie is a leading expert on the neuro-physiology of human performance. His work ranges from Fortune 500 companies like Cisco, Google, and Nike to the US Naval War College and Red Bull. He combines a background in expeditionary leadership, wilderness medicine, and surf rescue, with over a decade advising high-growth companies on strategy, execution, and leadership. He speaks to diverse and high-performing communities such as Young Presidents Organization, Summit Series, and MaiTai Global on the intersection of science and high performance. At the Flow Genome Project, he leads a team of the world's top scientists, athletes, and artists dedicated to mapping the genome of the peak performance state known as flow. Jamie and Steven have co-penned their new book, Stealing Fire: How Silicon Valley, the Navy SEALs, and maverick scientists are revolutionizing the way we live and work. Listeners will know I'm a big believer in the power of flow and a huge fan of co-author Steven Kotler's earlier work. And if you haven't listened to it already, check out episode number 15 on how flow can help you increase productivity by 500%. So without further ado, I bring you co-founder of the Flow Genome Project, Jamie Wheal. Firstly, thanks so much for giving up some time to speak to the listeners of Future Squared.
Absolutely.
Yourself and Steven are probably two of the most foremost names when it comes to this topic, so I think our listeners will get a lot of value out of this and just be thrilled that you've made the time to appear on the show.
Fantastic. And the one thing I'd love to be able to do, because this is the thesis of the book, is that where Rise of Superman is explicitly about flow and using action sports as the case study, this book, Stealing Fire, is to say there's an even bigger category of non-ordinary states that we call ecstasis. Flow is one of them, but then you have meditation, mystical states, smart tech-enabled states, sexually enabled states, psychedelically enabled states. They all have, and this is the whole point of the book, they share the same underlying neurobiology.
Sure.
Once you see that, you realize, oh, there's all these fragmented subcultures. They're all barking up the same tree without knowing it. And there's actually a $4 trillion underground revolution.
Wow.
That's hiding in plain sight. So that's the what's new, what's next.
Fantastic.
Element. And there's a bunch of different ways to get into the meditative contemplative states. You know, everything from traditional sitting practices to smart tech to nootropic. to whatever, right?
Cool. So you're joining us are you in Colorado or Austin at the moment?
Yeah, I'm actually in Austin, Texas right now.
Oh, fantastic. We're actually making our way, so I'm sending the whole team here. We're a team of 6, and I'm sending the whole team over to South by Southwest in March, so that should be fun.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I'll be mentoring at the SXSW EDU conference, which is the education arm of South by Southwest, so that should be a lot of fun.
Oh, brilliant! Now it's an absolute stark raving zoo that week, but I'm sure you'll be up for it.
I'm sure I will. I think Tim Ferriss published a podcast about how to prepare for and hangover tonics and all sorts of stuff specifically for South by Southwest. So I'll probably have to re-listen to that one before I head over.
Nice.
Cool. So I guess for the benefit of our audience, firstly we'll touch on flow, and then we'll get into some of the other states that your new book talks about, such as the psychedelic states and the meditative states. So for the benefit of our audience who aren't familiar with the term first coined by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi back in 1975, what is flow?
Yeah, so fundamentally, flow is a non-ordinary state of consciousness, meaning it's different than our day-to-day waking state, and it has a sort of telltale shift in neurobiology, which we can talk about in a minute. But how it feels is I tend to experience a moment of selflessness, so I lose the inner voice inside my head, and I get drawn deeply into the present moment, so a sort of sense of timelessness. Everything I do seems to be effortless or easy, and basically the gap between thinking and doing shrinks to almost nothing. And the final bit is a degree of richness. We often find ourselves connecting to or having access to information that we don't normally. So selflessness, timelessness, effortlessness, and richness, or STIR for short.
One might draw parallels to, say, a surfer riding a wave, where the rest of the world kind of slips away and their concentration is absolutely intense and way beyond what it normally would be, and they're just focused on riding that wave and staying on it as long as possible. Is that fair to say?
Oh, it's very, very fair to say. And if you think about the amount of time and effort that surfers put and risk and challenge in cold ass waters and sharks and all sorts of things just to get those 3 to 5 seconds in the barrel of a wave gives you a sense of how potent and compelling it is.
Yeah.
And so there's a whole lot of triggers that can drive us into flow, but 3 of the easiest ones are consequence, embodiment, and environment. So if we have rich environments, meaning they're unpredictable, they're novel, it's not just like bouncing a basketball on the same hardwood court, right? But it's a wave, it's shifting and changing, it's a mountain, it's a business challenge, whatever it is, it's unpredictable, so I have to pay real attention to it.
Yeah.
Deep embodiment, meaning the more of myself I'm using, the more likely it is to push me into a flow state. And then consequence. Samuel Johnson, the old English philosopher, said, there's nothing like the prospect of being hung in the morning to clear one's mind, right? And so for someone paddling in to catch a drop, or you're going to get slammed on the reef, right? That's a high consequence move. For a startup that says we have 6 weeks of runway till we're out of cash, that's a high consequence move. Right.
Yeah.
And so all of these things, and we pursue them through a lot of different mechanisms, not just action sports. It could be computer coding. It could be Pinterest. It could be hobbies and gardening and hiking and walking. That human beings get here a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
But all of them, once you're there, have a lot of similarity.
Yeah, and I love what you said there about the startup that's got 6 weeks of runway left. I mean, the amount of times that I have heard people say, I do my best work when I'm on a tight deadline. When I need to hand in that important paper by tomorrow morning, because I know some of the the triggers and the environmental factors around flow, things like high risk and having a very short time span to do something, kind of get people into that state.
Yeah, and there's a couple of interesting points around that, right? One is for all of us procrastinators out there, right? What we are, we can assign that to a multitude of sins and character defects, but you could, at our best, what we're actually doing is we're tweaking what Csikszentmihalyi called the equation. So one of his central ideas it's the Goldilocks principle. If things are too hard, we get stressed and we choke. If they're too easy, we get bored. And so if we're given an assignment, if we have a work, particularly in school, or we have a situation at work that doesn't completely engage us right off the bat, one of the first things we do is we're like, well, let's up the consequence. And now I have a presentation in the morning, and suddenly the consequence is up, and it has a chance to kick me up into the flow zone.
Yeah.
So procrastination and delay, or just constantly taking too many things onto my plate in order to keep that sense of urgency is a lot of ways we intuitively try and tune the challenge skills equation to keep things interesting.
Yeah, and on that challenge skills equation, I know that in Steven Kotler's previous effort, he basically said that research shows that tasks which are 4% more challenging than our skills are capable of meeting strike a chord at that midline between boredom and anxiety.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah.
I found that quite
Absolutely.
fascinating. Yeah, it's interesting because we're always in our organization putting together blended learning materials for corporates, right? And oftentimes we need to be treading a fine line between not making it too hard to the point where their employees don't actually want to do the work, and not making it too easy where they don't see the value in doing it because it's like, well, this is baby work, right?
Yep, and that is the perennial challenge of change management, education, and leadership. Right? It is. I think the U.S. Former General Colin Powell, he defined leadership, but I think you could substitute exactly what you're talking about. He said it's the art of taking people down roads they don't want to go to a place they all want to be.
Yeah.
and hacking flow, ideally, like if we can do it, you can get that 4%, you can get that sweet spot in the challenge skills, then it becomes self-propelling. Then people do want to take that next step, and they unlock the additional capabilities and capacities, and then you can help them plow that back into more capacity building. But it's a delicate dance for sure.
Yeah, and I guess in terms of going down a road that people don't want to go to get to where they want to be, and using flow to get there, it sounds as if that might, I suppose, integrate with the whole concept of, what Carol Dweck calls a growth mindset, where you need to put yourself into these challenging situations in order to get into flow, learn, grow, and get to that destination while taking a very, very challenging path to get there.
Yeah, I mean, big fan of Carol's work. First came across her decades ago, long before she even wrote the book Mindset. She was a footnote in the back of a study on Montessori, and that's where I first came across her. Yeah. And that's where she'd done some of her initial research, as had Csikszentmihalyi. And so yes, fundamentally, the idea of I am always learning, my results are the sum total of my efforts and preparation. That is an absolutely essential prerequisite. And then from there, you can kind of layer on a couple of additional sort of maps or models that are useful for sort of navigating flow.
Let's, we've touched on flow, and I know you're releasing a new book with Steven next month called Stealing Fire: How Silicon Valley, the Navy SEALs, and maverick scientists are revolutionizing the way we live and work. And the book essentially explores 4 years of investigations into the leading edges of this revolution. You've gone to the home of the SEAL Team 6, the Googleplex, the Burning Man Festival, Richard Branson's Necker Island, Red Bull's Training Center, Nike's Innovation Team, and the UN's headquarters. And you've essentially found that they're all seeking the same thing. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, this was an amazing kind of shaggy dog story because, as you mentioned, Steven wrote The Rise of Superman a few years ago, and we found ourselves in front of a lot of high-performing organizations and teams talking about flow, exactly the conversation we've just had. And something that kept happening was people kept buttonholing us in the hallways or at dinner afterwards, and they say, hey, by the way, we are zapping our brains with electrodes. We are doing these off-prescription pharmaceutical stacks like Provigil or Adderall or whatever. We are going to kinky sex workshops. We are going to 9-day meditation intensives. Teams of engineers in Silicon Valley. We're microdosing engineering team. What do you think? And we would always be like, good God. I mean, we thought we were pushing the envelope, just talking about flow, and here's everybody else actually way further down that rabbit hole than we were. So we were faced with a choice. We're like, okay, either, and the routine question they'd ask is this thing I'm doing flow? Is it what you're talking about? And so we were in a bit of a goofy spot where we're like, okay, look, either we stretch the parameters of what is officially and sort of academically defined as flow almost to the breaking point, to the point where none of the researchers who have pioneered the field would still recognize it. Or we have to roll it up and we have to create a bigger category that includes them all. And so of course, particularly, thanks hippies, basically all the last 40 years of discussion of non-ordinary states of consciousness has sort of been hopelessly mired in counterculture baggage. So we didn't really find any working terms there. So we had to go all the way back to the ancient Greeks and went back to word origin. We're like, okay, the ancient Greek word ekstasis, which is our antecedent for ecstasy and everything else, The literal translation means that which takes you outside yourself. We thought that was actually a fairly good working definition that could include meditation and mystical states, sexually induced states, flow states, action and adventure sports, art-based, or even knowledge worker-based, and ultimately also psychedelic states. And we figured that sort of those three legs of that stool provided a fairly interesting sort of lens to put on bigger investigation of all these non-ordinary states. And because we had in our flow research kind of created what we've been calling the genome of flow. Here's the neuroelectricity, here's the neuroanatomy, here's the cardiac conditions, the respiratory conditions, the postural conditions, all these elements. We kind of laid it over and it almost functioned like a Rosetta Stone. We're like, wait a second, we're now able to translate all these different languages from, as I said, think about CrossFit biohackers, absolutely yoked, muscled guys, and they're doing the prescription stacking. And then you've got, like I said, tech nerds who are engineers, microdosing. And then you've got, 50 Shades of Grey reading, orgasmic meditation housewives, and all these different people who never talk to each other. And you've got the executives of Google and Silicon Valley traipsing off to Burning Man, and then you've got the military guys using sensory deprivation and float tanks, which again were sort of mainstays of the counterculture. So these guys could walk past each other on the street and never know that they were members of the same revolution. But by laying that Rosetta Stone of the neuroscience over it, we're like, I think actually you guys are all doing the same thing. Yeah. So that's when we're like, well, is this true? Are we just out to lunch? Is our data size too small to really make a thing? And we started looking. We said, well, what is the altered states economy? How much are we spending collectively to get out of our heads? Yeah. And we added it up, and that was everything from licit and illicit chemicals, easy, to psychotherapy, self-help, all the info marketing, kind of personal improvement stuff, Tony Robbins, all that kind of stuff, all the way through social media, all the way through streaming pornography and gambling, anything that is predominantly pursued for the state shift versus some other tangible goal. And the number we ended up with was $4 trillion, wow, which is a mind-boggling amount. That's as much as the GDP of the that's more than the GDP of the UK. It's the same as the GDP of Germany. It's about a quarter of the GDP of the United States. And you realize, dear God, that's a massive amount of money and time we're all sinking into. Not all productively, not all intentionally. That's the price tag we're willing to pay for even a shot at getting out of our own heads.
Well, everybody's always looking for that altered state of being, I guess, especially when their current state of being is perhaps not all that satisfactory to them. But you've touched on so many points there, Jamie. But one thing that kind of stood out was startups, engineers, microdosing. So taking this way back to Steve Jobs, he often credited his creativity to dropping LSD back in the 60s. And countless rock artists like Pink Floyd and so on have also said the same thing. And I know today there is more evidence of people, not just startups and engineers, but high-performing athletes and just high performers in general who are microdosing, whether it's LSD, whether it's GBH, ayahuasca. What are your thoughts on microdosing, and what sort of applications of it have you seen, and what have the results been of that microdosing?
Yeah, so, and again, because our overarching thesis, it's so easy to get kind of pulled down into the sensationalism or the controversy around any of these given practices. But our overall thing is what we really would like people to gain is cognitive literacy, which is an understanding of how our brains, bodies, and minds work, how we can influence, and also how we understand who else is, not always with our consent, right? Tweaking the knobs and levers of our minds to their ends as well. So step one is cognitive literacy. So if you roll all this stuff up, you're basically saying there's what we call kind of the big six neurochemicals that come in play during many of these states. So it's not always lockstep and it's not always in a block together, but this variation. And it starts out with norepinephrine, which is basically when people talk about adrenaline, right? Dopamine, the reward chemical, endorphins, pain reliever and sort of general euphoriant, anandamide, right, which also reduces pain. Runner's high was once upon a time thought to be endorphins. It's actually been more revised to have as much to do with anandamide as anything else, but it also promotes lateral thinking. And then oxytocin and serotonin. right? And oxytocin is, again, in pop blogging, it's called the cuddle drug or the love hormone or the trust hormone. But in reality, I mean, it can do those things, and that's fantastic. But it can also prompt ethnocentric tribalism. So like when you've seen like these populist political movements in the United States and Europe over the last 18 months, one of the things that like rallies do is they prompt oxytocin release and a definition of the other. We are more violent and less trusting of the people in the out group when we start playing with oxytocin. Molly Crockett at Oxford University, who we interviewed for the book because she had done research on Burning Man and its impact on Burning Man, was actually just at the World Economic Forum last week and giving a presentation on basically mob rule and what's happening with the serotonin system. So basically, this is all a roundabout setup to come back to your question, fundamentally, like what's up with psychedelics and are they useful? Well, most of the psychedelics that you just described interact with the serotonin system as well. And so serotonin is a tryptamine as well, and it was discovered, largely discovered right around the same time that initial research with LSD and psilocybin was taking off in the 50s and 60s. All that research got shut down in the mid-60s, just, gate kicked down, and we got Prozac instead. So Prozac interacts with the same serotonin system, MDMA. So you basically say in the last 30 years, right, the two of the most, well, I would say, you could say there's four really popular drugs, two legal and prescribed by doctors and two illegal and largely vilified. It's the Prozac MDMA combination, both of which interact with the serotonin system, right? And then you've got the, crystal meth, the sort of Breaking Bad and Ritalin combos. And there's only one molecular bond difference between crystal meth and Ritalin. And it just lets meth crank across the bloodstream a little bit faster. That's it. Wow. And the same, now there's MDMA and Prozac interact with our serotonin system differently and interact with different receptor sites differently. But that's what we're doing. So with this advent of microdosing, and for anybody that knows this, James Fadiman was the original researcher back in the 60s. He did stuff at Stanford, Hewlett-Packard, all these things on creativity and the impact of subperceptual threshold doses of serotonin system. And the engineers went wild. They solved all kinds of problems in 6 months. Basically, the criteria was that you had to be admitted to the study if you were an engineer working on a hard problem and you hadn't been able to solve it in 6 months. And they did subperceptual threshold, meaning I don't feel anything, my vision stays the same, I'm not anywhere near sort of tripping, but then I go back to work on those problems. And they had something like 9 significant breakthroughs in a group of 36 people. So that research came to a stop, blam. And Fadiman in the last 5 years has been reviving it through kind of anonymous crowdsourced microdosing report. So he said same protocol, 1 day on a microdose, a tenth of a functioning dosage, 3 days, rest, recovery, integration, practice, and reboot. And they just said, just fill in the blanks and let us know how it's going. And the research has been, again, pretty compelling. And most people are saying, I have access to greater problem solving, I have access to greater creativity. And there's been additional studies on saying, sort of ancillary benefits of cessation of addictions like smoking, less compulsive behavior, voluntary choices towards greater, healthier eating, better rest, movement, meditation, etc. So the jury is still out on which is doing what when, but it is fair to say that we've known very little about the power and interventions that we can conduct within our serotonin system. Back to Molly Crockett at Oxford, she is continually suggesting that it's a massive interaction on both the positive, the pro-social movements, i.e. we connect, we get together, we do good things. And her point on the violent, regressive populist movements is that they are quite often functioning from a serotonin deficiency. So however you want to cut it, there's a lot of people that are sniffing around, how do I get back to a balanced, high-performing serotonin system? And what am I doing to tweak that stuff is, varies wildly between what folks know and what they have access to.
Would you say then that there's a correlation between people that have that serotonin deficiency and, I suppose, depression or acting out in ways that are not in harmony with society's sort of conventions?
Yeah, I mean, and again, I would encourage anybody to kind of, Google Molly Crockett, check her out. She's doing some interesting stuff, and I think that that is a solid thesis to try and validate or falsify in the coming years. Our take would also be it's probably not just the serotonin system. It probably involves a sort of constantly dynamic cocktail of those big 6 neurochemicals that we talked about.
Yeah.
And it's not that there is a singular happy place for us all to get to and stay in. It's much more, do we have flexibility and adaptability on tuning the knobs and levers of our consciousness for the tasks at hand, right? And what our goals are.
We've touched on microdosing with illicit drugs. Now, if we just hop, skip, and jump across to the world of nootropics, which seems to be a fast-growing sort of craze over in Silicon Valley especially, and whether it's things like David Asprey's Bulletproof coffee, brain octane, consuming MCT oils, or perhaps jumping on a ketogenic diet to increase the production of ketones. I imagine you would have uncovered some insights into that world as part of your research.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, more power to everybody who's trying to unlock greater performance. I think there are some potential pitfalls in the excesses of the biohacking community. There was a Tibetan teacher who came over to the West. He went to Oxford and then moved to the States, called Chogyam Trungpa. He was largely responsible for bringing the Tibetan Dharma to the West. And he had a phrase he called, he said, beware of spiritual materialism, meaning I get so into my practice that then becomes another thing to inflate my ego. And the very tools and techniques that we're supposed to get rid of it are actually entrenching it or inflating it even further. Yeah. So he called that spiritual materialism. And I think there's also there's a potential of biohacker materialism, which is we're trying to hack, we're trying to optimize, we're trying to do all these things, and it's like in service of what? And at what point do we geek out on these 17 elements to my stack and my day and my ice bath and my, all these things, and the butter in my coffee, and is coconut oil any better than MCT oil? And you're like, okay, and then what? What happens when you're bulletproof? What bullets are you going to step in front of?
Exactly. And so, that's a great point, Jamie. Sorry to interject. And I think it's probably not just applicable to nootropics, but anything. I think it's easy to get carried away with anything and then have this sort of inflated sense of self-worth, whether it's exercising and going to the gym every day and then looking down upon someone who goes to the gym 3 days a week instead of 6 days a week. Even people who say they meditate to get out of their ego and then, without even realizing it, get back into their ego when they look down on other people for being not being present. So it is easy to kind of let your practice result in what you said, what you called spiritual materialism.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also just on a really bottom line sense, I mean, this is me personally, and I'm just not wired that way. I'd rather, I've always been give me something that just knocks me out. It's jaw-dropping, beauty, truth, reality, whatever it is. Go climb a mountain, go surf a big wave, go do those things. If you think about nootropics, the placebo effect is good for somewhere between 30 and 40%, right? And that's sugar water. That's just the power of our mind. And for comparison, Prozac, again, one of the most widely distributed drugs on the planet in the Western world, right, is good for maybe only 3 to 7 points better than that. So Prozac, for all of its costs, for all of its side effects, right, is only 3 to 7 points, outperforming your imagination. So between that, right, and yes, this nootropic and all the stuff I'm spending my money on is incontrovertibly worth it, and I no doubt about it have a performance increase, I would say it's a fairly high bar to clear before you're in the clear of absolutely, hell yes, this is worth my time and money. And I would generally take the case that between the placebo effect and stuff that absolutely works, basically everything I'm aware of that absolutely works requires a prescription or is a Schedule 1 or 2 controlled substance. Right. And that's why there's Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 controlled substances. So in between, go live life. Save your money. Give it to somebody who needs it. Don't make really expensive urine that you just keep pissing into the toilet, thinking it's turning you into something you're not.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, and if you did go down that path, then it's about doing something with it. Like you said, when you are bulletproof, quote unquote, what do you do with that? Are you just bulletproof and you just exist as being bulletproof, or do you actually go out there and create impact in the world, do something amazing, inspire other people, or do you just sit there and, hey, I'm bulletproof, I'm way better than you?
Yeah, I was wondering about that. I mean, particularly obviously with the political climate and everything that's happening, and there are a lot of people kind of thinking, maybe I'm supposed to get off my ass and do something different this around now. And it's true in the kind of online entrepreneur space. It's true in the startup space, which is there's an awful lot of Instagramming and this is my amazing life.
Yeah.
Here I am in Thailand. Here I am at Davos. Here I am at South by. Fill in the blanks, right? And so that we've kind of created this cult of personality around the kind of tech nomad, where I have access to money, I can work from my laptop, and this is my lifestyle design. And And I just wonder, at what point do we come to the end of that thread too?
Yeah.
And it's like, hey man, little blue marble, lots of people on it. We are the 1% of the 1% of the 1% who won the lottery. Is there something more to do with these amazing good times and experiences that we've been totally blessed to just be in the right location and time and space to have access to?
That's a great point, Jamie. So digging a little bit deeper on the neurochemicals you mentioned earlier and anandamide, you said that prompts lateral connections and generates insights and creativity. That's something I'm a big believer in. I always cringe when I hear of large organizations running brainstorming sessions and saying, okay, between 10 a.m. and 11 a.m. today, we're going to get everyone together and you're going to come up with the next game-changing idea and we're going to dominate the industry. But as we know, most people have their ideas when they're going for a run, in the gym, all sorts of places. How do we help, I suppose, people develop more anandamide? And I suppose, what are the lessons that you've uncovered in terms of your research around creativity and innovation? Because our audience is full of entrepreneurs, corporate innovators, people looking to create new products that, make a difference in the world, solve problems, but oftentimes fall into the trap of just business as usual.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we write about this in the book. We got to participate in Red Bull's Hacking Creativity study, and it was the largest study ever done. It was sort of 30,000 interviews, artists, athletes, musicians, politicians. I mean, across the spectrum of anybody who has achieved excellence and prominence via creative pursuit. And they did this crazy ass data analysis. I mean, if you go on their website, Hacking Creativity, I think you can just Google it. Multi-dimensional graphic representation, almost like brain neodes. And here's all the nodes and connections, and here's how it all interrelates. And they crunched all that data, massive amount of data. And they came up with at least a couple of conclusions, which is, A, creativity is essential for solving 21st century problems, surviving, thriving in this marketplace, et cetera. And B, biggest giant gap in that whole little meshwork that they rendered was learning how to train it. It was virtually non-existent. And the reason, or at least the reason we would advocate, is that because people have been trying to train it or teach it as a discrete skill. Yeah. And it's not a skill, it's a state of mind, or more to the point, it is an emergent property of your state of mind. And that state of mind are these non-ordinary states of ecstasis. Yeah. Because if my head is crammed with my inner monologue, and if I've got tunnel vision, attention to literally what's in front of me, and I'm, conscious processing is 120 bits a second, right? Unconscious processing is several million, up to, maybe 11 million, depending on how you count, right? There's a massive amount of the bit stream we tune out. We're like those horses walking around in the city pulling carriages, with the blinders on so we don't get freaked out. Yeah. That's our normal waking state. So really, the game is just how do I peel back those blinders from time to time, and then trust that creativity, the aha insight, whatever those things will be, will emerge when we've succeeded in making that state shift. And 3 examples, right? And back to the big picture point of the book Stealing Fire, which is it doesn't matter which door you go into or go through to get to these states. So they did studies with Tibetan monks and meditation. They would have bursts of gamma wave, these kind of eureka insights, these integrative moments, right? The aha moment took them 34,000 hours, right? So that's a long ass time. And then there was a series of studies saying how many monastic corners can we cut but still get some ROI on sitting practice. They whittled it down to 4 days. So you went from 30 years to 4 days, you still get bang for your buck. Now I could pound Red Bulls or coffee, and I could eat bad pizza, and I could pull an all-nighter trying to get to that breakthrough moment. And I might once or twice, but generally speaking, the quality of my thinking and ideas is going to degrade. That's not a sustainable way to do it, right? Or I could meditate for a bit. University of Sydney, right near you, did a study on creativity and asked people, asked a control group to solve a 9-dot problem with this. There's the 3x3 grid of dots on a page, and you've got to connect them all without picking your pencil off the paper. And the trick is you've got to actually realize, I've got to draw past the dots so I can do these big, nice angles that connect it all. Well, normally, less than 5% of the population figures it out. In the control group, nobody did. And then they all got transcranial magnetic stimulation. They got a pulse of magnetic energy through the front part of their brain, their prefrontal cortex. And then 40% of the group solved the problem in record time. And then psychedelic studies, we were microdosing experiments with James Fadiman earlier, right? Those studies all, had a number of breakthroughs, close to a dozen legit breakthroughs. I mean, that meant patentable, buildable, fundable outcomes, after 6 months of bashing their head against a wall. And that's, Tim Ferriss, when we interviewed him for this book, said, virtually all of the billionaires in Silicon Valley I know use psychedelics on a regular basis. They're thinking at a complex systems level, and they're attempting to solve wicked problems. And so when you realize that, the question is not how do we train it as a skill, it's how do we cultivate the state of mind from which it emerges, so that when I'm going for the run, when I'm having that cold shower, when I'm waiting, when the lightning strikes, right? There's the old joke of the Zen teacher who finally tells his students, he's like, enlightenment's pretty much an accident. And one of his students just snaps, loses his mind. He jumps up and he's like, you've had me chop wood and carry water and sit on this cushion for all these years. If enlightenment's an accident, why do you have us do all that? And he goes, to make you more accident prone. So I would say that that's probably the biggest insight about creativity. It's not a skill to force. It's a state, it's a state to cultivate where you can become more creativity prone.
On creating that type of state within the office, you mentioned the bit stream, you mentioned the internal dialogue in our minds, but there's also a lot of external factors that stop people from getting into that creative state or creating an environment where they can have these moments, these aha moments. Like, for example, you could have notifications on your phone, on your desktop. You could have meetings every 30 minutes. You could have people while you're trying to do some creative work, whether it's writing an article or a paper of some kind, and someone taps you on the shoulder and takes you out of that state where you're trying to be creative. What can people do? Say, not everybody is an extreme athlete, not everybody is a CrossFitter, not everybody is doing these alpha human things. But if they're behind a desk doing creative work in a large organization, which is often bureaucratic, what can they do to help, or what can executives at these companies do to help these people create that creative state?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and we piloted an in-depth program with Google and their engineering team. So, exactly all the parameters and constraints that you just described, including such a rigid, the funny thing is Google has the entire world's information. They are completely on lock when it comes to sharing any of their own people's. Yeah. So we couldn't even get them to upload certain apps, right, that they needed to do the program. But that said, a handful of things that are really easy and anybody can do. The first is, when you end your day, just pause for 2 minutes and jot down the 3 most important tasks, what we call just MITs, for the following day. That's not just the top of your to-do list. That's if I had to move the needle professionally, and I only did those 3 things, it's a stark raving win. And write them down, leave them on your desk. Now, the reason we say do that the night before is because what we talked about earlier, intrinsic versus extrinsic processing, or subconscious versus subconscious versus conscious. By doing it then, by organizing your mind then you sleep on it. There are whole elements of your brain that are continuing to process, continue to integrate, and you basically, it's like the shoemaker's elves, right? You get a few of your shoes already made for you when you wake up in the morning. And by the time you sit down the first thing, start versus you just shaking out the cobwebs then and saying, now what the hell am I doing today? The next is those most important tasks. If it is at all humanly possible, and most people will swear it's not because their life is too busy and they're too important, or they don't have enough power in the organization. But if it is at all humanly possible, you come out of your morning routine, you've woken up, you've hopefully moved a bit, you've fueled up your body with some kind of good clean power. Drink a pint of water first thing. We sweat at least 16 ounces, so we're all chronically dehydrated. Yeah. So just first things first, slam a pint of water, get to your workplace, wherever it is, put on your headphones. Brain.fm is a great brain and training audio. There's a lot of old school tech like Holosync and some of that stuff. That's kind of 70s era baby boomer shit, and it's pretty bunk. Brain FM, they're doing parallel studies with Northwestern University, and at least as we can tell so far, seems to be one of the stronger emergent leaders these days in sort of next gen tech. Put on headphones, block out sounds and distractions, block off your calendar, and try and protect that first 90 minutes of your workday religiously. And if you can do that, and you combine that with now, and do not go near inbox, right? Tim Ferriss routinely says, right? Your email is the mind killer. Don't go near it. Open up your, whatever it is, a blank sheet of Microsoft Word, whatever your actual deep thinking and work, because you don't get paid to answer emails. You collect the big bucks for being you at the top of your game.
Yeah.
And if you can ID them the night before, work on them for the first 90 minutes when you're at peak cognitive freshness, save meetings for the afternoon when you're probably pretty taxed, and a little bit of relational moving and that kind of stuff is actually better to do then anyway.
Yeah.
And then if you really, really want to plug into, and then there are things called Pomodoro apps, which basically are just little timers on your laptop, and your ass every hour for about 5 minutes. I bang out push-ups whenever I find my attention flagging. There's a great 3D lunge matrix. It's not Gray Cook, but it's somebody like that. But if you look up 3D lunge matrix online, there's YouTube videos. It's a great. You're not just doing forward and backwards lunges. You're doing diagonal ones and that kind of stuff. And that is really helpful to undo desk-bound sitting. And if you want to do an HRV or breathing app, during that 5-minute changeover. So once every hour, I move my body, I focus on my breath, right? And I get back to my task. And then you can maintain that momentum in a fairly significant way.
You mentioned going to sleep and letting your subconscious solve problems for you. So I think Reid Hoffman always says he never goes to sleep without giving his subconscious a problem to solve. And then he wakes up in the morning and, problem solved. Or at least he likes to say that.
Yeah, and I mean, so much of this starts overlapping, very obviously with just basically attention and time management 101.
Exactly.
And all the kind of performance hacking tips. But really the question is what are you doing in the service of? So in some respects, one analogy I like to think of is it's a little bit like being a dinghy boat, sailboat racer, and your goal as a racer is to basically take the gusts of wind, which would normally tip a boat over, and you hike out, you lean, and you try and keep your boat flat so that the most of your sail is pointing straight up in the air, and it carries you along as fast as possible. And that's equivalent to your peak experiences. So when you have these amazing moments, don't lose your mind. Don't change your name to Ramthar and move to a hut on the beach and say you're never coming home. Keep a flat boat. Flat boat's a fast boat, right? So you counterbalance all that energy that's coming into your system, and you put it into forward motion. Yep. And then invariably, and then there's a lull, right? And what do you do then? You keep a quiet boat and you try and maintain hull speed through that lull. And if you're really skillful, you can watch the water and you can steer yourself to the next gust that's coming, even if it means turning around and changing direction, right? And that's how a fast racer, in fact, Jimmy Spill, right, the Aussie who won the America's Cup for Oracle, right? That's what he did. And that's how he had the biggest comeback in America's Cup history, racing against the Kiwis. And so that's what I would recommend, is that people use these techniques. You go court the big wins, you go court your peak experiences, make the most of them, but don't get tipped over by them. Yeah. And then in the lulls, in the day-to-day grinds, the Monday to Friday parts, be as efficient as we can to preserve your speed and momentum.
What you said there about when you're retreating, for example, it reminds me of a general's quote that we're not retreating, we're just advancing in a different direction. So sometimes you need to do that to maintain that sort of sense of flow or being in that state, rather than pushing against it.
Absolutely. And in basketball, there's the idea of like a pick and roll. Like when you run up against somebody, what's the most elegant way to fundamentally, when we talk about flow in general, we say, look, there's 4 stages. You start out with struggle, then you relax or release, then you go into flow, and then you recover. And we basically say, look, forget about the release and the flow state. Forget about it. Just learn to struggle more gracefully and recover more deeply.
Yeah. Yep. So
if you do those things, your quid's in on the in-between.
Yeah, and you mentioned a few different tools and essentially time management techniques. Do the hard things first. Block out time in your diary where you're uninterrupted. Use binaural beats like Brain FM. But the reality with most large organizations is you will get interrupted. So do you have any advice for people in terms of, hey, I'm in this great state, I'm super creative, I'm getting shit done. Oops, I've been interrupted for 5 minutes and now I'm back at my desk and that whole beautiful state I was in, it's gone. Is there any way to get back into that state quickly, or do we invariably suffer the cognitive switching penalty and it could take us 10, 20, 30, 40 minutes to get back there?
Yeah, I mean, exactly what you said, right? I mean, studies are 15 minutes minimum and potentially longer when we get shifted. So you can say, hey, it doesn't matter. But the bottom line is if you have a really hard thing to do, I mean, we just gave a talk at the Future of Work at Cisco, right, at their headquarters in Silicon Valley. And they had a crazy stat. I mean, it's so crazy I didn't even really believe it. But they said something like 70% of office space in the United States is only intermittently occupied. Meaning that like people are traveling, they're on business trips, and quite often they hide out in coffee shops to do their own work, right? People are not going to the workplaces to get work done. They're going because they have to. They're going to be seen. They're going to attend a meeting, but they're not actually going because that's the place they get the most done.
Yeah.
So, simply is, really protect and socialize your environment. You will be surprised. People assume there's no way I could. Open office plans, right? Open office plans are a bane of deep concentration. And they caught on in the last 10, 20 years because it represents kind of an egalitarian, we're all in this together kind of mindset. And we value that. But the reality is, if you want, knowledge workers to solve hard problems, give them doors that shut and give them water coolers to have happy. You want the connections, you want the unstructured interactions, but you do not want perma chaos and call that activity. But to your point about, okay, if I do get knocked out, all that said, if I do get knocked out, what do I do about it? Fundamentally, quick breathing exercises. You can do SEAL Team box breathing. You could do a heart rate variability app. You can definitely continue to leverage the brain FM. You can change that from focus to concentration to relaxation. You can do different states, right? And put yourself back in that state. And so that's what I would encourage at the sort of baseline level for resilience. And if you want to get, Josh Waitzkin, do you know Josh's stuff? Yeah. The Art of Learning, right? He's got some great tips, and we've kind of combined them with some of the stuff that Red Bull athletes have been doing. But it's basically create a performance priming practice. So you basically fuel, so have something like hydrate and have something to stabilize your blood sugar. Move, do some brief activity, like just what we were talking about, 3D lunge, do a lunge matrix, or do push-ups and pull-ups, or yoga if that's comfortable for you, whatever it is. So fuel, move, breathe, right? Do 3 minutes of, if nothing else, just deep, slow, regular breathing, and listen. Have a playlist that is specifically geared for you, and that can be tunes you really know, like, and love, or it could be something like Brain App, acoustic wallpaper, and you connect that then to a high flow activity, whether that's going surfing or dancing or that lights you up. Do that, and do that enough that your body and your brain get really used to those 4 steps: the fuel, breathe, move, listen, and then a flow producing activity. And then over time, you can then swap the activity for anything you need to do. For you need it, right? What do you need? I mean, it's just like Olympic athletes when you see them with their headphones on and they're visualizing their gymnastics routine. You start priming and encoding, and you can compress all that. It doesn't have to take 15 minutes to half an hour. You may invest that time up front. Over time, you can get to the point where you can just you're grabbing the handle of a door. You're about to go. You imagine the lyrics of that song. You take 3 quick breaths, right? And you've triggered and primed that state. So you can use what you call sort of somatic markers or somatic anchors. And basically there's a pin in the map. I know what that feels like. I know how to get back there, and I'm just punching the buttons of my bodily and cerebellar memory to go back there. Increasingly it will. But it's a fair, fun exercise.
Thanks so much. You've given our audience a lot of stuff to research and implement in their own lives. But before we go, I can't let you go without getting you into our lightning round.
Absolutely.
Okay, so question number 1 is, if you could work for any company at any stage of the company lifecycle other than the Flow Genome project, who would it be and why?
I mean, it's such a cliche, but it would probably be Branson or Musk. Because of the attitude they have to solving global problems.
Great answer. Question 2 is, if you could ask anyone a question, dead or alive, who would it be and what would you ask?
Good heavens. Anyone alive? Anyone dead or alive? Probably Jesus or Socrates. Those would be my first 2. And let's see if it's the same question. I don't think it's a question. I would actually just want to look into their eyes and take the measure of the man.
Just look into their eyes.
Yeah.
Cool. Love it. And finally, Jamie, this one's a it's an interesting one because given the topic we've just discussed, it's pretty much aligned, but it is around rituals and routines that keep you on top of your game. Obviously, you've touched on a hell of a lot of them there, limiting interruptions, using tools, psychological factors, environmental factors, external things. Are there any particular rituals or routines that you haven't covered that you partake in, say, every morning to help you stay on top of your game?
I would say joyful, celebratory sex with a dedicated, loving partner as practice, meaning we do it whether we feel like it or not, versus as an exclamation point on the end of a good day.
Fantastic. Okay, Jamie, so obviously people can pick up a copy of the book Stealing Fire at Amazon. They can find out more about you and the work you're doing over at Flow Genome Project. They can find you on LinkedIn. Are there any other websites they should be visiting?
Yeah, so simplest is you also find us on Facebook. There's a huge amount of fans, so flowgenomeproject.com on Facebook. Like us, you can stay in tune there. And stealingfirebook.com is the place where we are really launching this book and launching it as a sort of manifesto for a revolution in hacking this stuff and having a good time while we do it.
Great. Thanks so much, Jamie. Thanks for giving up some time and speaking to the Future Squared audience. And we'll share all that good stuff in the show notes for our listeners.
Fantastic, man. Thanks for having me, Steve.
Thanks, Jamie. Hey guys, it's Steve again. If you're picking up what we're putting down, we'd love it if you took just a minute of your time to like, share, or subscribe to Future Squared on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Stitcher. It would mean a hell of a lot to the team here who work effortlessly to bring you thought leaders and experts on topics of corporate innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-improvement on a weekly basis. As always, you can find more resources on innovation, including blogs, books, podcasts, videos, webinars, and tools at www.collectivecamp.us. If you'd like to connect with me on Twitter, you can do so at Steve Glaveski. That's Glaveski. Until next time, keep innovating. Future Squared out.